What the heck, Dan? I'm wondering, Peloton had a breach and they exposed 4 million user records, and I'm wondering, how did that happen? What the heck?
Yeah, indeed, it's a really good topic, and pretty indicative of a lot of breaches that we see out there. So let's dive right in. What ended up happening here was Peloton was using, like most people do, an API to communicate between their screens, that front end that you see on the bikes, and the back end where all the data resides, right? And I think maybe like a lot of companies felt like these APIs were maybe hidden, undiscoverable, or maybe just don't need to worry about it. But sure enough, someone found it, and one of those APIs turned out to have access to, as you said, all 4 million user records in the Peloton application.
Yeah, it's so, to me, I almost think it's like they would not even have said we have an API. For them, it's just like, well, we built an application that partly runs on the bikes and partly runs on our servers. And yeah, somehow these things probably communicate, but I don't think they would have said we have an API. It's
Yeah,
not even kind of in their minds.
it's hard to know exactly, what the thought process was. I mean, I think there's always a lot of pressure on developers to just get stuff working and make it happen. And this API was the right way to glue everything together. But what didn't happen was sort of a risk assessment to say, like, can this thing be abused? Can it be found? Could somebody use it unintentionally or in ways we don't expect it to be used? And the evidence of that is that this API was left wide open, right? There was no password requirement, no security, no authentication on it. But that's not all, right? So at some point, it became known to Peloton through, I don't know, notification or, whatever it was. And they quote unquote fixed the issue, right? So they went in and they added password requirement and security to that API endpoint. And all that meant was Dan has to prove he's Dan to get into that inner sanctum. But once I'm in, I still had access to all 4 million user records, right? Including if you had marked your account as private, like I don't want other people to friend me or access my stuff inside the Peloton application. This API still had access to all of that, even Joe Biden's records accessible through this, right? And that's a whole different type of issue, right? That they solved authentication, but they didn't really address authorization.
And it's probably also, I would assume, a question of how easy it is to implement those fixes, right? I mean, just like put a wrapper around it that requires some kind of authentication. That's relatively easy, but then doing more like a fine granular access control, that probably would have been quite a bit more work, right?
Yeah, it's a really good point. So adding authentication is actually probably something the security team would be able to do, right? So if they were using something like an API gateway, you could do that, right? The security team would maybe even be able to do that themselves. But solving authorization, which is basically like, can Dan see Eric's records? That's kind of a logic issue, right? And that's typically got to be handled inside the application itself. Now, it probably isn't even all that hard either, but it means going back to development, right? And saying, listen, we need to add some logic in here that says Dan only can see Dan's records. And it's probably, not even more than a line or two of code to do that. But that's where we see a whole bunch of API flaws and vulnerabilities and breaches ultimately.
And in the end, oftentimes you mention these OWASP API top 10. So when we look at this Peloton breach, how many of those did they manage to hit?
Yeah. Well, we know for sure they hit 1 and 2, right? So number 1 is broken authorization, right? So can user A access user B's records? OAuth 2, weak or broken authentication, or in this case, no authentication. So we know we got that too. You might even argue OAuth 3, excess data exposure. Like the fact that this API was returning sensitive information, the records of people who've marked their accounts as private, that sounds to me like excess data exposure as well.
Coming back to, fixing those things, or even better, preventing them from happening, which probably would be better.
Yeah.
How would you say, like what was the biggest, let's say, flaw in terms of the process, the way they approached building a product that led to this even, right? Because
Yeah.
ideally we don't want to fix those things. We don't want to have them.
Yeah. We often talk about the three pillars of API security being governance, testing, and monitoring. Well, governance is really about like how are you defining, developing, and deploying your APIs, and I think that means like having some thoughtful process around what is this API, why does it exist, why do we need it, what data is it touching, how is it going to be used, and then how should it be protected, right? And have like a thoughtful process around it. Testing is like, let's actually test. Like this would have been easy to find with some pretty simple testing, like look for unsecured endpoints, look for cross account access issues, and that sort of thing. And I think the core of the issue is, we're always running so hard, especially putting a lot of pressure on dev teams to get new functionality out there, code fixes, new features. There's not always a lot of time. So I think the one of the best things we can do is to raise awareness, especially with the engineers, the people who are developing APIs, to understand how APIs are getting attacked, how they're getting targeted. And with a few simple things like adding security, controlling authorization, looking at excess data exposure, you can protect against a whole lot of these breaches.
And I'm, coming back to my initial remark, I would assume, that they went down the route of saying, oh, we don't need API governance, so to speak, or security because we don't even have APIs, right? Like I think nobody ever went that far to even realize that maybe we should, care a little bit more about that. But that's just my theory. But I think that's what actually may have happened.
So yeah, I think, one of the issues is just, creating that awareness that we have APIs, understand what they're doing that risk assessment. Like, is this API touching sensitive information? How are we controlling access? So yeah, there's a lot of things. I think just raising awareness can really help a whole lot. And, if people want to learn more about this topic, definitely invite you all to check out AppySec University, where we've got a whole bunch of courses and can help you learn more about it.
Great. Thanks for joining, Dan. So that was another interesting and scary study of what can go wrong. Thanks so much.
Yeah, looking forward to the next one.
Yes, there will be more, that's for sure. So
Yeah.
thanks everybody for joining. If you liked it, please give a thumbs up and consider subscribing. And until next time, well, keep getting APIs to work, but also keep them secure. Bye, everybody.